Hey everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. Let's talk about the steadfast love of God out of Psalm 106. Psalm 106 both begins and ends with the writer talking about the steadfast love of God, the never-changing love of God. Verse 1 reads like this: Praise the Lord, O give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. And then in verse 45, when he's concluding the book, he writes, For their sake he remembered his covenant, and relented according to the abundance of his steadfast love. So we have steadfast love bookending this chapter. What's in the middle? The answer is, in the middle, there's an inventory, a list, a remembrance of all of the sins of the psalmist people, all of the sins of the Jews. From the time that they first became a nation and up until the psalmist is writing, he goes back and he lists a number of the times they rebelled against God or weren't as faithful as they should have been or did terrible things even. And you might think that's really weird. Why would you talk about the steadfast love of God and then talk about all the sins of these people? And it actually makes a lot of sense, because the sins in the middle of the chapter confirm the truth that he's mentioned on both ends. God had all this reason, all of these opportunities to forsake these people, to stop loving them because they didn't love him. And yet, through it all, he doesn't. What I find interesting about this is that if you know anything about the Psalms, they're written roughly halfway through the Old Testament. So the psalmist knew about all the sins that had happened before him. What he didn't know was about the 1,000 years of the rest of the Old Testament. He didn't know the half of the sins that Israel was going to commit in those 1,000 years, because they continued to turn their back on God. They continued to rebel against him, and sin was abundant in that next 1,000 years of Jewish history. But when we step into the pages of the New Testament and we see what happens there, we find that the truth that he confirmed back in 106 is consistent. It's still true, because finally and completely, once and for all, God confirms that even throughout all of this rebellion, he still loves his people. His steadfast love still endures. And the final statement of that, the confirmation of that, is Jesus coming to die to take away the sins of those who sinned against him. I thought about that in my own life. I've been told for a long time that God always loves me, that his steadfast love endures forever. And when you're young, I think that's kind of abstract. I'm now 29, but in the same way that the psalmist does here, I can look back at my life and I can take an inventory of all of the sins of my past. And what I realize is that I look a lot like the Jews when the psalmist talks about them. There's a lot of sins in my past, and I come to the conclusion now, as far as I can see at at age 29, and I realize, wow, I've done a lot of sinning, done a lot of things that I shouldn't do, but God is still with me. God still loves me. This truth is still confirmed. And although my intention is not to sin and I want to avoid it at all costs, if the Lord allows me to live to be 70 years, 80 years old, I may not know the half of the wicked that I do in my life. I hope that's not the case, but it may be the case. And I'm going to stand before God someday at the conclusion of it all and look at him and take an inventory of all that I've done. And I may think, wow, there's a lot of evil in my past. But as long as I stayed with God, with Christ, in him in my life, what is God's response to that evil going to be? It's going to be exactly the same as it was when Jesus came on the scene after all of this evil. And that is to confirm, finally and completely and forever, eternally, that his love still endures forever, because my sins have been forgiven through Jesus.